unlock this gate for you. Got the key right here. Get along now, Daddy. Destroy.
Hi everybody, it's 214 React here. Today we're looking at Lost Coast in DirectX 8 mode. Now I'm making this video because the other day I launched Lost Coast and realized that the graphics didn't look quite right, and what I realized was that it had launched in DirectX 8 mode. I don't know why. I think they've changed something where now you have to put in -DX level 9 in order for it to run in DirectX 9. You can see here the hardware DirectX level is DirectX version 8, and as you can see here there's no launch options for the game whatsoever. But if I put in DirectX 9.5, it will then properly go up to DirectX 9. Bit of a weird bug, don't know why that's happening, it wasn't happening before, but I thought it'd be interesting to make a video on how Lost Coast looked in DirectX 8. Now as you can see here, the model detail goes from low, medium to high as usual, the texture detail goes to very high, just like it does in the post 2007 build of Source, I believe. Shader detail goes to high, water detail goes to reflect all, but the shadow detail only goes to medium. Color correction is completely blanked out, so I don't think that's active. Anti-aliasing will allow you to go to full 8 MSAA, anisotropic filtering 16 times, vertical sync on and off, vertical rendering you turn it on and off, motion blur can't switch on and off at all, and high dynamic range is available in the drop down, but it's not actually active in the game. I thought this was really interesting because I just find it funny how some of these settings work under DirectX 8, some don't. I even tried knocking it to DirectX 7 mode like you used to be able to do. You can't do that anymore, even by putting in DX level 7 in the command line in the launch options. So it's just interesting how things have changed over time. It's interesting what the limitations of DirectX 8 are. So we're going to look through in the video what some of the differences are. Let's dive in. So here we are at the very start, and immediately you can tell the water looks completely different using a DirectX 8 shader. Yeah, I don't know if that's a fixed function thing. It's probably not because it's DirectX 8, but it's probably just a much less advanced shader. Like shader model 1? In fact, what that looks like is a bump map that's moving over the surface of the water. I believe so. I think that's an old technique where you just have a bump map that moves over the surface of the water, and then you sample that bump map, and that's how you get the refraction underneath it. But because it's just a bump map moving over the surface, it's just very uniform, and that's why it just looks like very undynamic. Not very realistic, not as realistic as the DirectX 9 water, but it does have a very nice nostalgic look to it. Oh, it's so nice though, I love that really shiny, glossy bump map sort of look, and with the refraction of the water. Oh, there's some stuff here, some specular mapping, and the one thing you really notice is that as you go up here, you can see the sort of replication in the bump map. So there's like square, 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 because it's just one bump map that's moving. Probably not moving, but some sort of offset, so the bump map is being sampled at different points to give it the impression that it's moving, and it seamlessly aligns with itself as it goes through, but it still looks like each square, 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 much like the textures on Oblivion used to look like. As you can see, it's very much running in LDR in terms of the lighting calculations. If we go into the options, we can go to here and we can flick high dynamic range off, and it shouldn't make any difference. And flick it back on. Yeah, it's the same. So I think what's happened there is, for some of these settings, they realize that you can't use these with DirectX 8, so they grey them out. I'm guessing HDR was added in long after they stopped really supporting DirectX 7 and 8, and someone's just forgotten to grey that out, so it's still selectable, even though it does nothing. I've always found that HDR in Source Engine makes the game look a lot different, and we'll see that when we look at some more of the DirectX 9 footage. Because without HDR, it feels more flat, and it feels more lifeless, or not lifeless, but more liminal sort of space. You know, what everyone is saying about the Source Engine now. But when you add HDR in, it adds a bit more depth to the scene and makes it look a bit more realistic in certain ways. But there is, again, a certain aesthetic appeal, even if it is just nostalgia, to having HDR off and going with the old LDR pipeline. Let's move on up. The textures all look the same. I don't think they actually put any high-res textures into Lost Coast, but we'll see in DirectX 9, and that's why the very high texture setting in the menu doesn't make any difference to the textures.
You're that scientist chap, Friedman, Fishman.
This is another example of where HDR really makes a difference.
Take on the Combine.
Because with the extra lighting calculations,
no other reason to visit
this
St.
dude
Olga
looks
at
a lot
time like
more
this. I'll take you to where they
realistic,
made their base, or as
in a
far
sense.
as I can, at any rate.
And again, it's that difference between pre-HDR source and post-HDR source. And HDR source has that, especially with this character, we'll see in DirectX 9, it has that 2006 look, where it's just HDR was new, bloom was new, and they just went really over the top with it. And of course, yeah, there's no bloom on the crossbow here, except like a little sprite of bloom. You can just see on the red hot rebar there's a little sprite to give it the impression of bloom, but no actual bloom. Let's give ourselves all weapons, because another thing that will be missing is the Fong shading. Yep. There is no per pixel shading, I believe, on the weapons and stuff. It's just vertex shading. Up here we can see even more of the limitations. There's of course the skybox limitation, which I think is even in DirectX 9, because that's where the skybox comes up. So that'll be a separate area where there's still water out there, but because it's the skybox, there's different lighting on it, which means there's a distinct gap between the water within the game world and the water outside of it. But here you can really see that grid look of the water. Really, really obvious. Got the very basic shadows here. Yeah, the old school static shadows, which I believe would be a abstract light source coming from one direction, which would be placed towards the sun, and that's where all these shadows are based from, shadow mapped. And in the later versions of Source, and probably when we turn DirectX 9 on, you'll be able to see more dynamic shadows behind the torch and stuff. So you won't just have the directional lights, you'll actually have in-world lights being able to affect the shadow maps. Oh yeah, quick look at some of the fire over here. I think that's still the new game engine fire, where it became a particle effect rather than a sprite. Hopefully we'll see some fire up close and be able to determine that later. So I don't know if that fire effect actually requires DirectX 9. I think that is the old sprites. So these areas as well, this is again where it looks a lot more flat. Old school Source, obviously. And we saw it in my Counter-Strike Source video, where in areas where you didn't have HDR, they have a much flatter look. But in some ways, it looks a lot more clean. There's something just aesthetically pleasing about Source with no HDR. And you can see the sun here as well. The sun's just got a very uniform sort of brightness to it. and you've got these like baked in shadow maps. I really do think that is what gives Source its kind of creepy look, the kind of flatness of the old lighting. Now this area is where we will really see the difference. Even in the windows, even the windows look a bit... Yeah, definitely not as... I think that the shading on the windows isn't as advanced. We've got the specular here, which is very DirectX 8 style specular. Be interesting to see how that differs in DirectX 9. But generally, again, much more flatter looking. A lot more lifeless, nostalgic, but also creepy. When we shoot the windows out, it lets in beams of light, which look very spritey. You can kind of see the outside of the sprite there. So the sprite here. Because obviously there's not actually any volumetrics going on. Shading on these. Looks like a basic cube map. Yeah, cube map. Kind of see the pixelation there on that. I wonder if the cube map renders a little bit better in DirectX 9. So again, very flat sort of lighting there, just a sort of red colour. Because everything's so flat and uniform, because everything has to fit into that low dynamic range, so you don't get excessive clipping in dark areas or excessive brightness in other areas. To a little secret area here. Again, you can see this area, sort of strange things going on with the lighting here. I'm not sure what causes that. Definitely clipping there. Clipping to complete zero lightness. There's weird little red areas. We'll see how well they get cleaned up with HDR. Little area down here. Again, very flat lighting. So you've also got some bump mapping on these bits. We'll see what the bump mapping looks like on the DirectX 9 version as well. Fairly certain that looks a lot better in DX9. Same with the floor here, bump mapping on that. The torch is where it really starts to expose these things, because again, you have to fit all of that lighting data into a very small range. It's so weird, it's such a strange feeling game. Let's take out the helicopter. Trying to keep an eye on particle effects and smoke. I think that is the new flame effect, particle-based one, rather than the old sprite-based one. Up down to here. This is the bit where the height starts to really get to you. But again, you get another great look at the bump mapping on the water. And the edge bit, and the skybox. A nerve-wracking bit here. Have they done Lost Coast for VR yet? Because they should, because this would be incredible in VR. Hopefully they do. I think there's still reflection in the water from a planar, because it's definitely not screen space reflections.
You did it, lad. Legions.
But zooming in, the reflection seems to change a little bit. Interesting.
Well, I guess you got other places to be.
And now we've done a run through with DirectX 8. Let's switch over to DirectX 9 and do a run through for that and do some comparisons. Now we can continue on with the analysis. So, let's give ourselves all weapons. The textures on this just look better, I think, because it's got more bump mapping on it and the Phong shading. You can definitely see the Phong shading. Yeah, look at that. Ooh, yeah, very, very nice. Are the textures more high resolution, actually? Let's do a quick check. The wood isn't. This isn't. The rock isn't. No, I think the textures are just the same because there aren't any higher asset textures to take from this. But yeah, the big thing is the water. It really is. So it still has the reflections in it from the planar. I think the planar reflections actually look a lot better. So it's probably something much more advanced going on there. Yeah, look at that water overall. It doesn't look squared out anymore, doesn't look repetitive, it looks much more natural. And it also looks like there's a perspective thing going on as well. It looks like there's an extra calculation depending on how far away you are from the water to how much it is perturbing the water surface. So if you look close up, there's a certain amount of water being perturbed and the refraction below it. The further you go, the bigger that effect seems to become. If we go into no clip, we can have a look. This is close up water being perturbed. Get further away. Yeah. Look at that. The further away you get from the water, the more it gets perturbed. You see the motion blur kicking in there as well. I think what's happening here is the DirectX 8 version is just a simple bump map that's being offset across the surface of the water, and that's what's affecting the reflection and the refraction underneath. But this is actually a proper DirectX 9 shader program, and is actually taking the information from the planar reflections, the distance you are from the surface of the water, the angle of the lighting, stuff like that. It's just a lot more of an advanced calculation being done. That's why it looks so much more natural. And it's also why it doesn't have the grid effect. Or does it have the grid effect? It kind of does. It's only over that direction. What about this direction? Definitely seeing the distance as you approach the skybox. There's a sort of grid going on, but it's far less noticeable. I wonder if that's just because the shader still does have repetitive actions in it that sort of cause a grid, but it's just less noticeable. Oh. So when you go up high enough, everything stops rendering, and you're just left with some other things. Wow, that's weird. Going completely out of bounds. Oh. This looks like the skybox, or at least part of the skybox. See, this looks much more like the more basic, older effect, where it's just a texture moving across the top of the water with a reflection in it. Doesn't look like it has the same level of shading. Because yeah, you can see much more what it is there, the texture moving over the top. So I think that's the skybox. And that's where it starts to look like a grid. So that would explain why the skybox has that grid effect, because this definitely has it. Because I think the way Source works is that this is an actual 3D sort of space, but it's rendered as the skybox in the actual area up here. So that, I think that's it out there. And that looks like it has the old water effect, which has the definite grid effect. But this water here has the new shader effect. So let's have a look at the fisherman in HDR.
Hey,
as you can see, just looks a little bit more natural, just because the bloom gives a bit more detail to the textures, makes the skin look a bit more realistic. The lighting overall looks more realistic, and also the Phong shading on him as well adds to a bit more detail, makes it look a bit more realistic and a bit better, even if not more realistic, just a bit more aesthetically pleasing compared to the DirectX 8 version. So certainly an upgrade to the character as well. And then what we can do is we can have a look at him with the bloom off, but just HDR on. So even then, even without the bloom, that better lighting calculations and the Phong,
go on through, lad.
but especially just the lighting calculations, just make the character look a lot more realistic. So yeah, definitely an enhancement there. But as I say, when I switch the bloom back on,
Laddie, destroy that gun and
it looks even better. Again, as noted, you've got the HDR and the Phong shading, so you can see how much more in depth everything looks, as I said. With the, even just the pistol there, just the world looks a lot more alive, a lot less, again, liminal. With HDR off, it feels very 2004, of course, that's, yeah, Half-Life was first released. With HDR on and DirectX 9 and all the additional stuff, it starts to feel way more 2006, which is obviously when PS3, Xbox 360 came out, and you start to see a lot more HDR and bloom and post-processing stuff. Of course, this is subjective. This is someone who was around about that time playing those games. If you weren't, then it probably doesn't have that feeling. But the interesting thing is we can turn the HDR off, and all it'll do is turn the bloom off, and it's still processing in HDR, so it's still got that extra light range, but it's not applying that bloom to it, which gives it another look. It's also after they changed the shader on the pistol, because the shader changed a lot after 2006, I believe. That looks so nice. You've still got the extra brightness levels, but there's no bloom giving it that extra punch. And then we turn full bloom back on with HDR, and there we are. Look at that. It just fills out that sky. It makes the pistol look really good. And of course, we switch over to the crossbow. I don't think it has that little fake bloom sprite anymore. It's just got real bloom on it. Just got a really nice red hot glow to it. Again, looks totally different, along with the Phong shading on the scope there. And then if we turn the HDR off, which is just turning the bloom off, you can still see it has a nice red glow to it. And yeah, I think that little fake bloom sprite is gone. They've removed it, so yeah, that makes sense. And it still looks really red hot because they can up the brightness level on that without really affecting anything else in HDR. Again, just gives the game a really different look. And if we turn the whole bloom back on, look at that. Really, really nice. It looks really red hot.
Lad, get up the path.
Let's have a look at a bit more the reflections. I think the DirectX 9 planar reflections are a lot better. A lot more stable. Yeah.
Up the cliff. Step lightly now.
Yeah, look at that. The refraction's a lot better. Moving up from that sort of late 90s, early 2000s DirectX 8 into the 2000s DirectX 9, and then the sort of mid 2000s DirectX 9. Moving on as we start to approach the DirectX 10 sort of side of things.
Blood loss detected.
So here we can see the side of the building here, which looks completely different. Much more life to it. Because you've got the extra brightness and then the exposure changing. And let's check the shadows as well. I think it... Oh, no, there you go. You can see the dynamic shadows there. So it's not just the directional light shadow maps. You've also got real-time shadow maps coming from the torch and dynamic lighting sources. Look at the brightness on the gun there. The bloom on that. And as you come out, the exposure changes. It just looks so much more lifelike. Even the sky looks more lifelike. It still has a sort of liminal feel to it, but not so much. It just looks a bit more in depth. And it makes the textures look better as well, because the lighting is just better and the bloom gives a bit more to it. We'll have a look at those bump maps in a second. The other thing I've noticed is that the windows have a much better shader in them in DirectX 9. Much, much better. Compared to DirectX 8. And let's have a look in this internal area here. So there's still some clipping of the shadow maps in here, but it looks a lot smoother into these darker areas with HDR. And the torch also has much more of an impact as well. So obviously there's no global illumination, but even the sort of shadow mapped areas process a lot better with HDR on and bloom, which gives the world just a lot more depth, a lot more dynamic sort of feel. Got the bump mapping here as well, which looks a lot more subtle than in DirectX 8. Bump mapping here as well. There's definitely still bump mapping. It looks a lot less obvious. Obviously these textures are quite low res, so it's a bit more difficult to tell. Maybe what's happening is DirectX 8 mode was maybe using bump maps, i.e. grayscale, and this is actually using full RGB normal maps? Don't know. Could just be my imagination, it just looks better. Like I said, more subtle, less obvious that it's bump mapping, but more realistic. Got the window here, and then one of my favourite areas. This area just looks like 10 times better. HDR and the DirectX 9 stuff on top of that. Yeah, the extra shadowing from things. You can see that dynamic shadow coming from the chairs. Way, way, way better shading on the windows. And smash a window through. And it's way less obvious that these are sprites. There's still some weird clipping stuff going on here. Again, some of the weird ambient occlusion stuff from the drivers. But also I noticed in the performance test there's like weird clipping of geometry missing, which I think might just be a versioning thing with the source engine again. But even this area, look at that. The lighting just looks way better. Much more depth to it. Even gives the impression there's global illumination going on here, but I don't think there is. Because I think you've got the blue light coming from here, which is hitting that, also hitting that. I really wish I could crank it into DirectX 7 mode. Whoop! Yeah, the bloom really does make everything look better, just on its own. And then we flick off the bloom, we're just left with pure HDR, which even then still looks a lot better because, again, the lighting just looks more realistic. And it still makes the textures look better, still makes the game look better, on top of the extra shading. We turn the bloom back on. Wow. Yep. I think we've seen everything here. Let's skip ahead to the helicopter bit where we can look down and see the water textures from really high up. Here we are on the helicopter bit actually, which again looks better just because of the backdrop being in HDR. And then boom. Yeah, I think those flame effects are the same. So I don't think it actually is. Even when you dial it down to DirectX 8, I don't think it actually is using those old sprite-based fire. Everything just looks softer, the lighting just looks softer and better. It's not just because of the bloom, it is because of that HDR pipeline. But the bloom really does help it. Which is what you start to see with ray tracing and path tracing as well. The light looks far, far softer and more realistic. And as we go through here, we can see a much wider area. We can see there's, again, the repeating textures out far, but then close up still looks a lot better. Oh yes, let's check out actually. What is the cube map like on this? The cube map looks a lot more subtle. That's interesting because there was a really obvious cube map in DirectX 8 mode. But this, it looks a lot less obvious. And it also looks a lot smoother as well. So I think the reflection, or the cube map shader, is a lot better. The shiny effect along here is basically the same as it was in DirectX 8. I think what happens as well is that there's samples that they use. So they're building a cube map around you, like in the reflection of the scope there. It samples the area around you and uses that as a cube map. So you've always got at least a somewhat decent approximation of what's being reflected there as it probes the environment and builds a new cube map. I'm wondering if that's what's being done with these panels here as well. I need to go back and check the DirectX 8 mode to see if that's doing the same in the scope. So if we bring this out here. Nope. Interesting. It looks like there's less detail, but it looks a bit more realistic rather than just the generic cube map that it had before, which looked really obviously like a cube map. Anyway, before we wrap up, let's check that scope, because again, you can see here the scope is reflecting the area we're in because it's probed the area. You can see it change as we move around. If we move to, say, in here, it'll probe it again and you'll see this area being reflected in the cube map. So if we go to here, see it's reflecting the windows now because it's probed that area. So let's see if it does that in DirectX 8. Okay, so here we're on DirectX 8 mode, and you can see that it is sampling that cube map in the scope reflection. It's always probing the area around it, but it's a lot less noticeable, and the reason why is because it's not doing a HDRI cube map because we're in DirectX 8 with no HDR. Therefore, the reflection looks a lot less prominent, and there's a lot less detail in it, because it's not able to take a full dynamic range sample from the probe, which means you can't have so much lighting showing out because you're having to fit everything into the LDR range. So it is still sampling the area around it and making a new cube map, but it just doesn't look as prominent because of course it's sampling it And then because it's a reflection, it's going to be less brighter than the actual thing, which means it's doing that calculation in an 8-bit range, which means it darkens the image down and loses a lot of detail. Let's have a quick extra look at the bump mapping here, while it's still fresher in my mind. Yeah, look, it just looks, like I said, it looks a lot less, it looks a lot more obvious that it's a bump map, rather than a lot more blocky. That's it, it's very much more blocky. Could it be that this is using the old form of bump mapping? Or maybe it's just a, I don't know, is it a lower resolution bump map? Is it just the calculations are doing a lot less because it's in DirectX 8? Or is it a completely different type of bump map? Could it even be in DirectX 8 mode, it's using emboss bump mapping? That could explain the sort of blocky look, as it's just offsetting the textures. Even the textures look different, don't they? Very interesting. Someone with some more knowledge of the source engine may be able to help me out in the comments. So yeah, that was a comparison between DirectX 8 and DirectX 9 in Half-Life Lost Coast. Do drop a like, thanks for watching. Let me know in the comments again if you know any more about the source engine than I do, and some of the things that I've pointed out here and how they work. Subscribe for future content. There's always new content coming up with tech and video games, so stick around. Hope everyone's staying safe, and I will see you in the next video.
Well, I guess you got other places to be.